When we think of the American Civil War, we imagine thunderous cannons, lines of blue and gray clashing on rolling fields, or Abraham Lincoln's somber figure at Gettysburg. But for many who lived through it, the war was also defined by something quieter, something revolutionary: photography. It was the first major conflict to be captured extensively on camera, and the images it left behind changed forever how people understood war. To grasp the hidden side of the Civil War, we must first step into the strange, chemical-scented world of 19th-century photography, and the people who wielded cameras as their weapons. In the 1860s, photography was still a wonder. The daguerreotype process, introduced in the 1830s, had already dazzled audiences, but by the time of the Civil War it had been replaced by the wet plate collodion method. This was a painstaking, dangerous procedure. A glass plate had to be coated in chemicals, exposed in the camera while still wet, and then rushed into a portable darkroom, often nothing more than a wagon lined with blackout curtains, before the plate dried. The photographer had only about 10 minutes to make the exposure and process it, or the image was ruined. Every photograph taken on a battlefield, every portrait of a soldier in uniform, was the product of immense skill, patience, and luck. Rare surviving photographs of Civil War photographers themselves show them standing next to bulky wooden cameras, their heads wrapped in black cloths, chemical stains on their hands. These men were not just artisans, they were pioneers, dragging fragile equipment across muddy fields, through enemy lines, into the smoke and wreckage of war. Each image they created was a small miracle, forged in hazardous conditions where one slip could mean shattered glass plates or ruined chemicals. And yet they persevered, because they understood something profound: photography had the power to shape history. For soldiers and their families, the photograph was both a comfort and a lifeline. Many enlisted men had their likeness taken before marching off, sending home a tintype or ambrotype tucked inside a small leather case. For some families, these became the last visual memory of a loved one who never returned. When you hold one of these tiny portraits today, with a young man's eyes fixed steadily on the lens, you are staring at someone who might have been dead weeks later. Photography gave ordinary people a way to leave behind a trace of themselves, a visual will of sorts, in an age when death could come suddenly and without ceremony. But not all photographs were meant for private keepsakes. Some were intended to stir public opinion. Studios produced grand portraits of Union and Confederate generals, carefully posed to project authority and nobility. Abraham Lincoln himself used photography strategically, sitting for multiple sessions that presented him as thoughtful, resolute, and presidential. One rare photograph shows him in 1860, beardless, lanky, his face marked with exhaustion. Another, taken just before his assassination, captures the deep lines etched by 4 years of civil war. These portraits were not just images, they were tools of persuasion, crafted to mold how the public viewed its leaders. Yet the power of Civil War photography lay not only in its polish but in its rawness. For the first time in history, cameras turned outward from studios and battlefields staged on canvases, and began to capture reality itself: muddy camps, battered buildings, weary soldiers leaning against wagons. Rare photos of Union encampments show lines of tents, campfires smoking, soldiers lounging on the ground with tin cups in hand. These were scenes of war few civilians ever witnessed, suddenly made visible. They stripped away the heroic myths and replaced them with candid glimpses of boredom, fatigue, and survival. And then came the photographs that shocked the nation, the aftermath of battle. Until the Civil War, war was usually imagined in paintings, engravings, or prose. Artists emphasized gallant charges, waving flags, noble deaths. The camera, however, was merciless. Photographers like Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady lugged their equipment to battlefields after the fighting, capturing haunting images of the dead. One rare plate from Antietam shows a line of Confederate soldiers sprawled in a ditch, their faces turned upward, frozen in the moment of death. Another shows bodies scattered across the fields of Gettysburg, bloated in the sun. These images were displayed in galleries, and newspaper reviews noted that visitors recoiled, whispering as though in the presence of the corpses themselves. For the first time, Americans could not look away from what war truly meant. Yet, even here, the hidden side of Civil War photography emerges. Some of the most famous battlefield images were not entirely honest. Gardner, for instance, was known to reposition bodies for dramatic effect, dragging a corpse into a more picturesque pose, placing a rifle in its hands. The intention was not malicious. He believed he was creating a more truthful representation of what had happened, but it reveals the tension at the heart of Civil War photography. Were these pictures reality, or were they a new form of storytelling, somewhere between fact and art? Rare notes from photographers suggest they wrestled with this question, even as their images reached wider audiences than any painting could. While battlefields and leaders dominated much of the visual record, some of the rarest and most fascinating photographs reveal moments of everyday life and human vulnerability. Soldiers posed for humorous, trick photos, pretending to balance bayonets on their noses or cradling pets in their arms. One little-known image shows a group of Zouaves, Union soldiers in flamboyant North African-inspired uniforms, joking together, their exaggerated pants and fezzes looking almost theatrical. These rare glimpses remind us that war was not only blood and death, but also the persistence of ordinary humanity under extraordinary circumstances. Photography, then, was more than a witness. It was a participant in the Civil War, shaping memory, influencing politics, preserving grief, and even altering truth. The images that survive are windows, but also mirrors, reflecting both the reality of the 1860s and the choices of the men behind the cameras. To see the Civil War through their lens is to step into a world where history and image fuse together, where myth is challenged by the stubborn clarity of glass and silver. And as we move deeper into this story, the photographs grow stranger, more unsettling, and more revealing. For beyond the portraits of generals and the grand battlefield scenes lies another world, rare, hidden images that strip away the varnish and show us the war as it really was, lived by ordinary men and women. It is there, in the overlooked corners of the photographic record, that the true hidden side of the American Civil War emerges. When we picture the Civil War, we often think of the clash of armies, the smoke of battle, or the grand strategies of generals. But for the vast majority of soldiers, war was not a daily march into combat. It was long stretches of monotony broken by flashes of terror. The rare photographs that survive from camps, barracks, and behind the lines give us a candid, sometimes startlingly intimate glimpse into this hidden side of soldiering. They remind us that before the charge and after the gunfire, the men in blue and gray lived, laughed, suffered, and waited. One striking photograph shows a group of Union soldiers seated around a crude wooden table, cards in their hands, a small pile of coins in the center. Their expressions are relaxed, even mischievous, as if daring the camera to catch them in the act of gambling, an activity officially frowned upon but universally practiced. Another rare image captures Confederate soldiers lounging in hammocks strung between trees, rifles stacked neatly in the background, their bodies slouched in postures of fatigue. These photos shatter the romantic image of endless bravery and reveal the ordinary rhythm of camp life, where boredom was the most common enemy. The daily routines of soldiers were grueling in their own quiet way. Rare images show lines of men washing clothes in streams, their trousers rolled up, water splashing as they scrubbed with homemade soap. Others reveal soldiers bent over letters, quills scratching against paper as they tried to compress homesickness, fear, and hope into words that might take weeks to reach their families. These images are haunting not because of death, but because of their intimacy. The faces are weary, the eyes sometimes red-rimmed, yet they are fully alive, clinging to the small rituals that tethered them to normal life. Food, or the lack of it, was another constant in camp. Surviving photographs display soldiers proudly holding up cast-iron pots or tin plates, often filled with little more than hardtack and salted pork. Some staged their food for the camera as though showing off a feast, perhaps out of pride, or perhaps irony. One rare photo even shows soldiers grinning as they bite into hardtack so tough it could crack a tooth, their humor a quiet rebellion against the monotony of their rations. In these moments, the soldiers themselves were co-authors of history, deciding how they wanted to be remembered in the fragile light of the camera lens. The camera also revealed bonds of brotherhood. Groups of comrades posed together with arms around each other's shoulders, their closeness a visible reminder that survival often depended on friendships. One particularly moving photograph shows three young men in Union uniforms, their hair mussed, their expressions half serious, half playful. We know from regimental records that within months, two of them would be killed in battle. Yet in that single captured moment, they are simply friends, alive and unaware of what the future held. The photograph becomes not just an artifact but a time capsule of fragile humanity. Not all camp photos were somber. Soldiers loved humor, and the camera sometimes caught them in staged pranks. In one rare image, a group of soldiers mockingly pretends to arrest a comrade, holding bayonets at his back as he raises his hands in exaggerated surrender. Another shows men in mismatched uniforms, one wearing a woman's bonnet for comic effect. These photographs remind us that soldiers sought levity to balance despair, that in the cracks of war's brutality, laughter still bloomed. The hidden side of the Civil War is not only its suffering, but also its stubborn insistence on joy. Yet, the camera also caught what propaganda tried to conceal: exhaustion and disillusionment. Some rare portraits reveal men slouched in their tents, faces drawn with fatigue, eyes that seem older than their years. Unlike the heroic studio images of polished uniforms and stern expressions, these candid photographs expose the toll of endless marching, disease, and uncertainty. They show us war stripped of glory, reduced to its grinding impact on flesh and spirit. One Confederate soldier, photographed in camp with his boots worn thin and his uniform fraying at the seams, seems to embody the slow erosion of both armies as the war dragged on. There are also haunting glimpses of the private mementos soldiers carried. Some photographs reveal men holding small framed portraits of wives, children, or sweethearts, pressing them close to the camera as if demanding the world not forget who they loved. In one rare tintype, a Union soldier clutches a locket in his hand, its tiny hinge visible even in the grainy image. Such details remind us that behind every musket and uniform was a web of human relationships, people waiting at home, lives suspended by war's uncertainty. The backgrounds of these images tell their own stories. Look closely, and you see rough-hewn log cabins hastily built for winter quarters, laundry strung on lines between trees, makeshift furniture cobbled together from ammunition crates. In one photograph, a small dog sits in the corner, its presence suggesting the companionship animals brought to lonely camps. These overlooked details turn each photograph into a layered record, not just of the soldiers but of the improvisational world they inhabited. Perhaps the most striking aspect of these behind-the-lines photographs is their silence. The men stare out from the past with an immediacy that words cannot match. You can almost feel the damp earth beneath their boots, smell the smoke of campfires lingering in the air. The photographs remind us that for every famous battle, there were thousands of unnamed days filled with waiting, working, and yearning. The hidden Civil War was fought as much in the quiet spaces between battles as in the thunder of cannon fire. And it is here, in these rare and candid photographs of camp life, that we see the Civil War soldiers most clearly, not as faceless ranks in history books, but as men caught between ordinary humanity and extraordinary circumstances. Their boredom, their humor, their exhaustion, and their fleeting joys all survive, pressed into glass plates and salted silver, carried forward to us across more than a century and a half. These behind-the-lines glimpses prepare us for the darker truths the camera captured next. For while camp life reveals the endurance of the living, the battlefield photographs that follow reveal the stillness of the dead. The Civil War camera, having recorded life in its most ordinary forms, would soon confront the public with images of war's most brutal reality. If camp life showed us soldiers in their most human moments, then the battlefield photographs revealed them at their most vulnerable, stripped of life, lying silent among the wreckage of war. The Civil War was the first conflict in history where the public could see, in stark and unflinching detail, the bodies of the dead. Rare photographs from Antietam, Gettysburg, and countless smaller skirmishes shocked 19th-century Americans, shattering illusions of glory and permanence. For the first time, death was no longer filtered through heroic paintings or dramatic prose. It stared back from the photographic plate, cold and undeniable. One of the most haunting series comes from Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. On September 17, 1862, more than 20,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Just days later, Alexander Gardner and his team arrived with heavy cameras and fragile glass plates. What they captured was unprecedented. One rare image shows Confederate soldiers sprawled in a shallow ditch, their bodies twisted, uniforms torn, rifles lying forgotten beside them. The composition is stark: no flags, no triumphant generals, only the raw aftermath of violence. When these photographs were displayed in Matthew Brady's New York gallery, the crowds fell silent. Newspapers reported that visitors whispered in hushed tones, as if standing among the dead themselves. For many civilians, this was the first time they had ever seen a photograph of a corpse. Death had always been present in 19th-century life, but it was usually softened: family portraits of the recently deceased, poetic obituaries, or idealized illustrations. The battlefield photographs were different. They showed bloated bodies under the sun, faces darkened by decay, limbs stiff in grotesque positions. There was no romantic veil. These were not noble martyrs draped in banners. They were young men, unshaven, mud-stained, and lifeless. Photography stripped war of its mythology and forced people to confront its consequences. And yet, even within these stark images, there were layers of complexity. Some of the most famous photographs were not entirely candid. Gardner, who worked both independently and under Brady, sometimes repositioned bodies for more dramatic effect. In one well-known Gettysburg image, often titled The Home of a Rebel Sharpshooter, historians later discovered that the corpse had likely been moved into the rocky niche where it was photographed. A rifle was placed in his hand to create the impression of a fallen sniper. To Gardner, this was not deception but storytelling. He believed that arranging the scene helped convey a larger truth about the cost of war. But it raises an unsettling question: were these photographs documentation, or were they constructed narratives shaped by the photographer's eye? Rare surviving notes and letters suggest that photographers themselves struggled with this dilemma. They knew that photographs carried immense power, more persuasive than any written report. By altering a scene, even slightly, they could make an image resonate more deeply. But they also risked creating illusions that future generations would accept as fact. The hidden history of Civil War photography is not just what the lens captured, but what the photographer chose to show, or to hide. Still, whether staged or candid, the images of battlefield dead were revolutionary. They brought the reality of war into parlors and newspapers across the nation. They unsettled those who had sent sons and husbands off to fight, forcing them to imagine bodies lying unburied in distant fields. They challenged Victorian ideals of noble sacrifice by presenting the blunt truth: war reduced men to fragile, anonymous figures sprawled in the dirt. And in doing so, they helped shape the national memory of the Civil War as both heroic and horrifying. But not every photograph of death was taken for public display. Some were deeply personal. Families sometimes requested post-mortem portraits of fallen soldiers if the body could be recovered. In these rare images, the dead were carefully dressed, posed as if asleep, surrounded by grieving relatives. To modern eyes, this practice may seem unsettling, but in the 19th century it was an act of love. Photography gave families a way to preserve one final likeness, to hold on to memory even in the face of loss. These intimate portraits rarely appeared in newspapers; they remained tucked in albums or frames, silent witnesses to private grief. Other rare images show burial details at work. Groups of soldiers with shovels stand near shallow graves, their faces grim as they prepare to cover the dead. In some photographs, rows of wooden headboards mark makeshift cemeteries, each hastily carved with a name, a regiment, or sometimes nothing at all. These photos speak to the scale of loss: so many bodies that burial itself became a military operation. They remind us that behind every battle statistic were individuals whose identities sometimes vanished in the churn of war. What makes these photographs particularly powerful is how they collapse time. To look at them today is to stand on the edge of history, gazing into the frozen silence of death more than 150 years old. The faces may be anonymous, but the humanity is immediate. One sees a hand curled awkwardly under a body, a cap fallen just beyond reach, a boot half removed in a final struggle. These small details, preserved in silver and glass, carry a visceral weight that words cannot replicate. They transform numbers into individuals, reminding us that war is not an abstract concept but a collection of shattered lives. The impact of these images extended far beyond the war years. After the conflict, many veterans spoke of how photographs had shaped public understanding of what they endured. For those who survived, the photos of dead comrades became haunting reminders of their own fragility. For those who never fought, the images were a window into a world they could scarcely imagine. The Civil War may have ended in 1865, but through its photographs, the reality of its death toll has remained perpetually present. There is an uncomfortable truth hidden within these rare images, photography both revealed and concealed. It revealed the cost of war, forcing viewers to confront mortality in unvarnished form. But it also concealed, through staging, framing, and selectivity, the full scope of suffering. We see some bodies, not all. We see aftermath, not the chaos of combat itself. What lies outside the frame, the cries of the wounded, the stench of death, the buzz of flies, remains absent. The camera showed enough to disturb, but never the whole truth. And yet, even within these limitations, the photographs of the Civil War dead remain some of the most important visual records in American history. They were the first to pierce the veil of heroic illusion, the first to confront a nation with the visual evidence of what war truly does. They continue to haunt us, not because they are beautiful, but because they are unflinching. As we move forward, we will see that death was not the only story the Civil War camera told. For every corpse captured on a battlefield, there were survivors, men who carried wounds, scars, and amputations for the rest of their lives. The next rare photographs shift our gaze from the silence of the dead to the resilience and suffering of the living, inside makeshift hospitals and crowded wards where survival itself became its own kind of battle. The photographs of battlefield dead shocked the nation, but for many who fought, death was not the end of their story. Survival came with its own kind of brutality. Rare photographs from makeshift hospitals, operating tents, and rehabilitation wards reveal a hidden chapter of the Civil War, one where victory was measured not in captured flags, but in limbs saved, lives patched together, and the resilience of men who bore scars for the rest of their days. Medicine in the 1860s was crude by modern standards. Germ theory was only beginning to be understood, anesthesia existed but was limited, and antibiotics were decades away. Infection, not the bullet, was often the real killer. Photographs of field hospitals show rows of wounded men lying on straw-strewn floors, their uniforms torn, their bodies bandaged with whatever cloth was at hand. Surgeons in blood-stained aprons stand grimly in the background, their instruments gleaming on nearby tables. These images are raw and unsettling. They show us that behind every glorious charge was a grim aftermath of sawing, stitching, and suffering. Amputation was the most common surgery of the Civil War. A musket ball or piece of shrapnel that shattered a bone almost always meant the limb had to go. Surgeons could perform the procedure in under 10 minutes, their speed born of necessity. Rare photographs of amputees, often taken months after the surgery, reveal men standing stiffly in their uniforms, one sleeve pinned neatly, or a trouser leg pinned above the knee. Some posed with wooden crutches, others with early prosthetics, awkward contraptions of leather straps and iron hinges. What is most striking is the dignity with which they presented themselves. These men wanted to be remembered not as broken, but as survivors. One haunting image shows a soldier with both legs amputated, balanced carefully on a chair, his eyes steady on the camera. There is no trace of self-pity in his face, only a kind of defiance. Another photograph depicts a group of amputees together, their missing limbs starkly visible, yet their postures upright, even proud. In the absence of modern therapy, photography itself became a form of reclamation. By posing for the camera, the wounded could assert their presence, prove that they still existed, that they had endured. The hospitals themselves were microcosms of the war. Rare images from larger facilities, converted barns, churches, even statehouses, show cavernous spaces filled with beds lined in endless rows. Nurses, many of them women, appear in the background, their white aprons marking them as rare beacons of order amid chaos. For patients, the presence of a nurse or volunteer could mean comfort as well as survival. Photographs of women standing beside wounded soldiers often radiate a quiet tenderness, their presence preserved alongside the suffering they sought to ease. Yet, these photographs also highlight the unevenness of care. Soldiers in urban hospitals often had access to better facilities and more experienced surgeons. Those in the field endured rough conditions, mud floors, makeshift tents, and hastily sterilized instruments. One rare photograph shows a surgeon's kit laid out on a table: saws, knives, scalpels, forceps. Tools that today evoke horror were, in that era, instruments of salvation. To see them captured in a photograph is to be reminded that survival often came at a terrible cost. For families back home, the photographs of wounded men carried deep emotional weight. Some amputees posed for portraits that they sent to loved ones, perhaps to reassure them that they were alive, perhaps to prepare them for the changes war had wrought. These portraits blur the line between tragedy and triumph. They were both evidence of suffering and proof of endurance. A soldier missing a leg might still stand proudly in his uniform, declaring through the photograph, "I remain whole, even if my body does not." Beyond individual survival, these rare photographs also reveal the beginnings of modern medical documentation. Surgeons sometimes commissioned photographs of unusual wounds or surgical outcomes for study. Albums of medical images, grim as they were, circulated among doctors, advancing knowledge that would shape future practices. Though never intended for public display, these collections survive in archives today, their stark honesty preserving the hidden cost of progress. They are uncomfortable to view, but they form an essential record of how war forced medicine to evolve. The human spirit is perhaps most visible in the group portraits of wounded veterans after the war. Rare images capture them gathered together in hospitals or veterans' homes, some missing arms, others legs, many leaning on canes. And yet, their faces often show camaraderie, resilience, even humor. In one photograph, a group of amputees sits in a semicircle, their crutches propped beside them, while a fiddler in the middle plays music. The scene is almost festive, a reminder that life persisted even in the shadow of loss. It is easy, from a distance of more than a century, to view these men as symbols of sacrifice. But the photographs bring us closer. They show the wrinkles around their eyes, the set of their jaws, the scars that laced their skin. They strip away abstraction and remind us that the Civil War was fought not only on the battlefield but in countless small struggles for survival afterward. The war continued in hospital wards, in rehabilitation, in the daily act of adapting to a changed body. These images also challenge us to reconsider what victory meant. For many, it was not triumph on the battlefield, but the ability to walk again, to hold a child, to return to a farm or workshop. Survival was victory, and the camera bore witness to it. Rare as they are, these photographs illuminate a hidden truth: the Civil War's legacy lived on in the bodies of its survivors, carried with them long after the gunfire faded. And as we turn from these haunting portraits of survival, another hidden group emerges in the photographic record: women. Nurses, spies, disguised soldiers, and civilians caught in the turmoil of war. Their contributions and sacrifices, often overlooked in the grand narrative, were also captured in rare and remarkable photographs. To truly understand the hidden side of the Civil War, we must now bring their faces into focus. When we think of the Civil War, the photographs that come to mind are overwhelmingly male: generals in uniform, soldiers in camp, battlefield strewn with the dead. Yet hidden in archives are rare portraits of women, images that reveal their vital but often overlooked roles in the conflict. They were not always on the front lines, but they were always present, in hospitals, in camps, in homes divided by loyalty, and sometimes even disguised on the battlefield. The Civil War camera, when it turned its lens toward women, captured a side of the war that history books long ignored. One of the most striking images is of Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross. In a rare photograph from the 1860s, she stands in a plain dress, her gaze firm, her posture unyielding. She was known as the "angel of the battlefield," moving between the front lines and field hospitals to bring supplies, comfort, and medical care. Photographs of Barton and other nurses remind us that women were the backbone of Civil War medicine. While surgeons operated, nurses dressed wounds, comforted the dying, and tried to bring a measure of humanity to inhuman conditions. Their photographs, though fewer in number, radiate strength born of necessity. But women's roles went far beyond nursing. Some became spies, using society's tendency to underestimate them as cover. Rare portraits survive of figures like Belle Boyd, the Confederate spy nicknamed the Cleopatra of the Secession. Her carefully styled hair and elegant dress belie the dangerous work she undertook, slipping information to Confederate generals and evading Union capture. On the Union side, women like Harriet Tubman stand as towering figures. Though best remembered for her work on the Underground Railroad, Tubman also served as a Union scout and spy. While no Civil War-era photographs of her in that role survive, contemporary images of her show the same unyielding determination that made her a force of history. These faces remind us that espionage was not only a game of men, it was often women who carried the secrets that shaped campaigns. Perhaps the most astonishing photographs, though, are those of women who disguised themselves as men to fight. By some estimates, hundreds did so, cutting their hair, binding their chests, and enlisting under false names. A handful of their portraits survive, usually discovered only when they were wounded and their identities revealed. In one rare image, a young woman in uniform sits stiffly, her features sharp, her eyes almost daring the viewer to see through her disguise. For her, the camera was both a risk and a declaration. She wanted to be remembered as a soldier, not a curiosity. These photographs pull us into a hidden world where gender boundaries blurred in the smoke of war. Civilian women also appear in rare and revealing photographs. Some are shown with their families, Union husbands, Confederate sons, daughters in mourning dresses. One particularly moving image captures a Southern woman standing with her children in front of a ruined home, her face set with defiance. Another shows a Northern mother holding a portrait of her son in uniform, the tiny framed image pressed close to her heart. These photographs are not grand portraits, but small windows into divided households, where loyalty was not just political but deeply personal. They remind us that the Civil War was as much a domestic crisis as a military one. The clothing and settings in these photographs tell stories as powerful as the faces themselves. Women in black mourning dresses appear again and again, their somber attire marking losses that touched nearly every household. Others pose in the fashions of the era, bonnets, shawls, hoop skirts, contrasted with the rough backgrounds of makeshift homes or war-torn landscapes. In some rare images, women sit beside armed men, suggesting that the boundary between civilian and combatant was thinner than we often imagine. Each detail preserved in these photographs expands our understanding of how women experienced and shaped the war. We also find women in roles that surprised contemporaries. Some were government clerks, others worked in munitions factories, producing the bullets and shells that fueled the armies. Rare group photographs show women standing shoulder to shoulder at workbenches, their hands stained with powder, their faces weary but determined. These images, though far less famous than battle scenes, are essential to the hidden history of the Civil War. They reveal how women's labor sustained the machinery of war behind the front lines. Even more rare are photographs of enslaved women during the war years. Some show mothers with children in contraband camps, recently freed but still facing uncertainty. These images are both tender and harrowing. A mother's protective arm around her child speaks to love and resilience, but the ragged clothing and weary expressions reveal the hardships of freedom won under fire. These women, too, were part of the Civil War story, and the photographs that captured them carry a weight that words struggle to match. What unites all these rare photographs of women is their quiet power. They do not shout like the images of battlefields, nor do they command like the portraits of generals. Instead, they whisper truths often left out of the narrative, that women were healers, fighters, laborers, spies, mothers, and mourners. Their contributions were not always recognized at the time, but the camera preserved their presence. Each photograph is a reminder that the Civil War was not only a man's war, but a national upheaval that transformed every life it touched. And as we turn from the women who nursed, spied, disguised, and endured, another hidden group comes into focus. Rare photographs also captured the lives of the enslaved and the newly freed, faces that tell a story not only of survival, but of transformation. Their images reveal the Civil War not just as a conflict between North and South, but as a turning point in the fight for human freedom. Among the rarest and most profound photographs of the Civil War are those of the enslaved and the newly freed. They stand as some of the most powerful visual documents of the 19th century, for they reveal not only the horrors of bondage but also the fragile dawn of freedom. These images, often tucked away in archives, capture the faces of men, women, and children at the very heart of the war's meaning. If the Civil War was about saving the Union, it was also, fundamentally, about the fate of millions whose lives were bound in slavery. And the camera bore witness to their transformation. In 1861, as Union armies pushed southward, enslaved people began fleeing plantations in growing numbers. They sought refuge behind Union lines, where they were labeled contrabands, property seized from the enemy. Rare photographs of contraband camps survive, showing families clustered around makeshift shelters built of wood, canvas, and scraps. In one image, children stand barefoot in the dirt, their clothes little more than rags. In another, a mother gazes directly into the lens, her infant in her arms, her expression both wary and resolute. These photographs are striking not only for their subjects but for their dignity. Despite the hardships of camp life, the camera captured individuals who were no longer property but people asserting their presence. Some of these photographs were used for propaganda, meant to stir Northern sympathy for emancipation. One famous series shows a young boy known as Gordon, or Whipped Peter, his back horrifically scarred from repeated lashings. The photograph circulated widely, shocking audiences in the North and abroad with undeniable evidence of slavery's brutality. To see the raised ridges across his skin was to confront the cruelty that polite society often tried to ignore. Images like this stripped away abstraction and made the case for abolition in ways words alone could not. Yet, not all photographs of formerly enslaved people emphasized suffering. Some, especially those taken after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, depict families dressed in their best clothing, sitting proudly for portraits. These were deliberate acts of self-representation. By sitting before the camera in formal poses, they claimed the same dignity afforded to white Americans in portraiture. A father in a suit, a mother in a bonnet, children seated obediently, these images declared that freedom meant not only survival but humanity recognized. They challenged the racist caricatures that flooded popular culture by presenting black families as dignified, composed, and enduring. Children born during the war became potent symbols of emancipation. Photographs of babies wrapped in blankets or perched on their mothers' laps often circulated with captions emphasizing their birth into freedom. One rare image shows 3 young children of mixed ancestry, dressed neatly in coats and dresses, seated in a studio. The caption printed alongside their portraits emphasized that they had been born free, their very existence a living argument against slavery's continuation. These photographs were distributed as cartes de visite, small, collectible prints that Northerners could buy and keep. In this way, the faces of emancipated children became both keepsakes and instruments of political persuasion. But freedom was precarious. The contraband camps, while sanctuaries, were rife with disease, overcrowding, and hunger. Photographs from some camps show rows of flimsy shelters, adults stooping to cook over open fires, children peering shyly from the shadows. These images carry a haunting duality. They testify to liberation, yet they also reveal the hardships of a life suddenly unmoored. The war had broken the chains of slavery, but it had not yet provided security, land, or stability. The camera froze these moments of transition, the uneasy space between bondage and citizenship. Rare photographs also capture black men in Union uniforms, part of the United States colored troops. Their presence in the photographic record is extraordinary. Dressed in blue jackets and kepis, rifles at their sides, they stare into the lens with pride. For them, military service was not only a duty but a declaration. They were fighting for their own freedom and for the future of their families. In one portrait, a black soldier stands with his wife and child beside him, his hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. The photograph radiates defiance against the old order. Here is a family intact, strong, and free. Such images were rare, but they endure as some of the most powerful testaments to the Civil War's deeper meaning. We also find photographs of black laborers behind Union lines, men working as teamsters, cooks, or builders. These images can be difficult to interpret, for they reflect both opportunity and exploitation. Some show men earning wages for the first time, their posture proud as they work. Others suggest the persistence of inequality, as black workers are shown in subordinate positions, sometimes with white officers in the foreground. The camera recorded both the promise of freedom and the stubborn persistence of racial hierarchies that would continue long after the war. Equally poignant are the rare portraits of black women who found themselves navigating new roles in wartime society. Some worked as nurses or laundresses for Union regiments. Others appear in photographs alongside white abolitionists, their presence symbolic of the alliances forged during the struggle. One rare image shows a group of freed women sitting together, their clothing patched but their expressions composed. They are neither caricatures nor anonymous figures, they are individuals asserting visibility in a nation that had long denied their personhood. The photographs of the enslaved and emancipated are perhaps the most hidden of all Civil War images, because they were often overlooked in favor of generals, battles, and political leaders. Yet, when we look closely, they hold the key to understanding what the war was truly about. They remind us that emancipation was not an abstract policy but a lived reality, carried in the faces of men, women, and children who had endured bondage and stepped into uncertain freedom. The camera did not always capture their voices, but it preserved their presence, and that presence is undeniable. As we move forward, the story shifts again. For beyond the emancipated camps and portraits of freed families were other civilians, white and black, northern and southern, who found themselves caught in the crosscurrents of war. Rare photographs of displaced families, ruined homes, and occupied towns remind us that the Civil War was not only fought by armies, but endured by civilians whose lives were forever changed. When most imagine the Civil War, they picture clashing armies, generals on horseback, or soldiers huddled in muddy camps. But for millions of civilians, men, women, and children who never shouldered a musket, the war came crashing into their daily lives. Towns were occupied, farms became battlefields, and ordinary families found themselves entangled in extraordinary circumstances. Rare photographs of these civilians, scattered across archives, reveal what textbooks often overlook, that the Civil War was as much about survival in kitchens and barns as it was about strategy on battle maps. One of the most haunting categories of images shows towns scarred by war. Photographers who followed the armies captured streets lined with rubble, homes with gaping holes from cannon fire, and families standing in front of what remained of their livelihoods. In Fredericksburg, Virginia, for example, photographs reveal civilians wandering through streets gutted by Union artillery. Women in bonnets and long dresses pick their way across debris, children trailing behind. Their faces, blurred by the long exposure, still manage to convey the disorientation of people suddenly made refugees in their own hometown. These images remind us that battles were not fought on empty landscapes, they were fought in the very heart of communities. Occupations brought their own strange realities. When Union troops marched into southern cities, photographers recorded scenes of uneasy coexistence. In New Orleans, one photograph shows white civilians standing stiffly at the edges of the frame while Union soldiers pose confidently in the center. The tension is palpable, conquerors and conquered sharing the same streets, their lives interwoven by force. In Nashville, women in morning dress appear alongside Union wagons, their posture rigid, their expressions unreadable. For them, occupation meant humiliation and survival in equal measure. The camera preserved this fragile balance of power, where everyday life continued under the watchful eyes of armed men. In border states like Kentucky and Missouri, where loyalties were deeply divided, photographs capture the raw pain of families split apart. In one studio portrait, a mother sits with her children, clutching a small image of a son who had joined the Confederacy, while her husband stands proudly in a Union uniform. The staged serenity cannot mask the fractures beneath. Photographs like this are rare, but they reveal the intimate scale of civil war, conflicts that were not just between regions but within households. These families lived daily with the knowledge that brothers might meet as enemies on the battlefield. Civilian suffering is also documented in photographs of refugees, both white and black, who trailed the armies in desperate search of safety. One image depicts a ragged group of Southern families pushing wagons piled high with belongings, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Another shows freed people camped beside Union wagons, their makeshift tents sagging under the weight of rain. These photographs are not heroic, they are raw, mundane, and painful. They force us to reckon with the war's impact on the most vulnerable, those who had no political power but bore the costs of shifting front lines. Among the most poignant civilian images are those of children. The Civil War was, after all, a conflict that robbed countless boys and girls of normal childhoods. Rare portraits show children dressed in mourning black, clutching framed photographs of fathers who would never return. In one heartbreaking image, a young girl stands barefoot in the ruins of Atlanta, her small body framed by the skeleton of a burned-out building. She looks into the camera not with fear, but with an unsettling maturity, as if the war had forced her to grow old before her time. These photographs speak of innocence lost, a generation scarred not by direct combat but by its shadows. The war also brought civilians into contact with death on a scale that defied comprehension. Photographs of makeshift cemeteries near towns, with rows of crude wooden crosses, show that battlefields were never far from domestic spaces. Families sometimes posed near these graves, memorializing loved ones who lay just beyond their doorsteps. In one image, a widow stands beside the grave of her husband, the mound of earth fresh, a simple marker driven into the soil. Her presence in the photograph transforms it from mere record into testimony, an acknowledgement that war was not just fought but mourned. Civilians did not always passively endure, some resisted, others adapted. Rare photographs show women working in fields, keeping farms alive while their husbands and sons marched off to fight. These women were often photographed in work dresses, their hands rough from labor, their eyes steady with determination. They are reminders that survival required resilience, not just resignation. In other cases, civilians profited from the chaos, running businesses that catered to occupying armies. Photographs of shops with Union signs in Confederate towns illustrate this pragmatic side of wartime life, where necessity outweighed ideology. We also catch glimpses of humor and humanity in civilian images. One photograph shows a group of townspeople gathered in front of a photographer's backdrop, playfully posing as if they were soldiers themselves. Their mock seriousness suggests a need to laugh, even as war raged around them. Another rare image captures children gawking at a captured cannon displayed in their town square, their faces a mix of awe and curiosity. These moments, though small, remind us that life continued, with ordinary emotions, even in extraordinary times. Taken together, these photographs weave a story of civilians caught at the crossroads of history. They were not soldiers, yet they bore scars every bit as deep. They did not choose the battlefield, but the battlefield often chose them. Through the lens of the Civil War camera, we see their endurance, their grief, their divided loyalties, and their small acts of survival. They remind us that the war was not only about armies clashing but about homes shattered, lives uprooted, and families redefined. And as we leave behind the world of civilians, the lens turns once again to the battlefield. For hidden in collections are not only photographs of generals and soldiers but also images of the war's grimmest legacy, battlefields littered with the dead, landscapes where silence spoke louder than any words. If earlier sections revealed the hidden lives of soldiers, women, and civilians, here we confront the Civil War's most haunting legacy, its dead. Rare photographs of battlefields in the hours and days after combat tore away the veil of glory that had long surrounded war. For the first time in history, cameras did not merely document generals or victories, they captured death itself. These images are stark, unflinching, and unforgettable. They changed how Americans understood war, and they continue to shape our imagination of the Civil War to this day. The earliest photographers to arrive on battlefields after combat were often greeted by silence. The guns had stopped, the soldiers had marched on, but the land remained scarred and littered with bodies. At Antietam, one of the war's bloodiest days, photographers like Alexander Gardner and his team set up their heavy equipment among the fallen. Their images of bloated corpses sprawled in fields and sunken roads stunned viewers back home. One famous photograph shows a Confederate soldier collapsed against a fence, his musket still clutched in hand. Another depicts the bloody lane, its trench filled with bodies piled like cordwood. These photographs stripped away the romance of battle and exposed the brutal price of war. In Washington, D.C., when Gardner's battlefield photographs were exhibited to the public in 1862, visitors were horrified. Newspapers wrote that the images had brought the reality of war to our doorsteps. For the first time, civilians could not look away or imagine that death in battle was noble and clean. Instead, they were confronted with faces frozen in agony, uniforms stained with blood, and landscapes where death lay in plain view. The camera had made the battlefield eternal. Gettysburg, fought in July 1863, produced some of the most iconic images of the war's aftermath. Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan, and others arrived shortly after the fighting ended, finding hillsides strewn with the unburied dead. One of the most famous images shows the body of a Confederate sharpshooter at Devil's Den, his rifle propped nearby. Later research suggests that the scene may have been staged, photographers moving the corpse and weapon to create a more dramatic composition. Yet whether authentic or arranged, the photograph seared itself into memory. It presented the lone figure of a fallen soldier, anonymous yet universal, embodying the tragedy of a generation cut down. Other Gettysburg photographs reveal the scale of devastation. Rows of corpses await burial in shallow trenches, their faces indistinct, their identities erased by war. The presence of laborers, both soldiers and civilians, digging graves adds to the sense of grim routine. Death was no longer exceptional, it was industrial, repetitive, and unrelenting. These photographs remind us that for every heroic charge remembered in story, there was an aftermath of rotting bodies, grieving families, and hastily dug graves. What makes these images even more chilling is their stillness. Unlike modern war photography, where motion captures explosions and action, Civil War cameras required long exposures. The dead were the only subjects who could remain perfectly still. This technical reality gave rise to a haunting paradox. In the photographs of battlefields, only the dead endured clearly, while the living blurred or vanished. Death, in these images, became the one permanent subject of the war. Beyond famous battles, rarer photographs exist of lesser-known fields. At Cold Harbor, Petersburg, and Spotsylvania, cameras documented skeletons unearthed by weather or stray shells, bones protruding from shallow graves. In one particularly disturbing image, skulls and bones are stacked beside a trench, awaiting reburial. These photographs were often hidden from public view, considered too grotesque for widespread circulation. Yet their very existence underscores the war's toll, more than 600,000 lives lost, each leaving behind remains that had to be dealt with in haste. Not all battlefield photographs showed only soldiers. In some, civilians appear, wandering through landscapes of death. Women searching for loved ones, children gazing at the ruins, townspeople helping with burials, these figures remind us that the battlefield was not isolated from society. It was often at the edge of someone's farm, someone's home. For these civilians, the aftermath was not a distant headline but a daily reality. Rare photographs also captured the first attempts to bring dignity to the fallen through organized burial grounds. The creation of national cemeteries, like Gettysburg and Arlington, was itself documented by the camera. Images show neat rows of wooden markers replacing the haphazard graves of battle. Workers carry bodies wrapped in cloth, reinterring them with care. These photographs reveal a transition from chaos to order, from anonymous trenches to consecrated ground. Yet even here, the overwhelming scale of loss is inescapable. Fields once soaked with blood became fields of graves, stretching to the horizon. The photographers themselves were deeply aware of their role in shaping memory. Men like Gardner and Brady did not shy away from presenting death, but they also composed their images to tell stories. A lone body against a stone wall, a fallen soldier beside a shattered tree, corpses scattered in the shadow of a farmhouse, each photograph became a narrative in itself, a silent testimony to the futility of glory. In their stark compositions, the battlefield dead became symbols not of victory or defeat, but of war's universal cost. Perhaps most haunting of all are the photographs where identity has vanished entirely. Rows of bodies stripped of uniforms, faces turned away, nameless forever. For families searching desperately for missing sons or brothers, such images must have been unbearable. Yet in preserving anonymity, the photographs also achieve universality. Each could be anyone's son, anyone's brother. Each image is a mirror held up to every household touched by war. These photographs of aftermath redefine not only the Civil War but the very nature of war photography. For the first time, the public could see war not through paintings or written descriptions, but directly, visually, undeniably. It was no longer possible to imagine battle as noble adventure. The lens had captured its truth, silence, stillness, and death. And yet, even in these images of devastation, there are glimpses of resilience. Photographs of survivors standing among ruins, of workers laboring to bury the dead, of communities beginning to rebuild, these, too, are part of the aftermath. They remind us that war destroys, but life continues, however scarred. The camera caught not only the shadows of death but the faint outlines of recovery. As we leave the battlefields behind, the focus of the camera shifts once more. Beyond death and destruction, the war also produced strange, uncanny, and even bizarre images, photographs that reveal the weird corners of Civil War life, from curiosities to odd inventions. These hidden and forgotten snapshots remind us that history is never just solemn, it is also strange, unexpected, and human. War is often remembered in solemn tones, heroism, sacrifice, devastation, but the photographic record of the Civil War contains another layer, the strange, the bizarre, and the downright uncanny. Hidden in archives are images that defy easy explanation, photographs that capture the oddities of wartime life. These are not the grand portraits of generals or the haunting scenes of battlefields, but curious fragments that reveal the surreal and sometimes absurd realities of the 1860s. They remind us that even amid tragedy, people found ways to mock, experiment, and bewilder. One category of strange photographs comes from the world of staged studio portraits. Soldiers on leave, eager to send mementos home, sometimes posed in deliberately humorous or exaggerated ways. In one rare image, two Union soldiers sit side by side, each holding a bayonet to the other's chest in mock combat, grinning as if the war were nothing more than a game. In another, a soldier leans casually on a cannonball as though it were a decorative prop. These playful photographs, while odd to modern eyes, offered levity at a time when death loomed everywhere. For families back home, they were proof that their sons could still laugh in the shadow of war. Equally strange are the trick photographs of the Civil War era. Long exposure times and experimental techniques gave rise to images that appear ghostly or supernatural. Soldiers would pose twice in the same frame, creating the illusion of twins, or blur themselves mid-shot, leaving a spectral imprint. Some photographs, likely taken as novelties, were later interpreted by grieving families as spirit photographs, evidence that the souls of the dead could be captured on film. Though most were simply the result of photographic experimentation, these uncanny images spoke to a society desperate to believe in connections beyond the grave. With so much death surrounding them, it is little wonder that families turned blurred photographs into messages from the afterlife. There were also practical oddities. Some photographs show bizarre wartime inventions that never made it beyond the experimental stage. A group of soldiers stands around a bulletproof wagon, its wooden side studded with metal plates. Another image depicts a strange contraption, a hand-cranked, multi-barreled weapon, that would later evolve into the Gatling gun. These rare photographs remind us that the Civil War was not only fought with muskets and cannons but was also a laboratory of innovation, producing designs that ranged from the ingenious to the absurd. Animals, too, appear in strange and unexpected ways. Soldiers often kept mascots, dogs, cats, even goats, that found their way into portraits. One famous photograph shows a Union regiment posing with a bear cub perched awkwardly among them. Another depicts a soldier holding his dog like a child, both gazing solemnly into the camera. These images, though whimsical, reveal the human need for companionship amid chaos. They also underscore how the photographic record captured not just strategy and suffering, but the small eccentricities that made life bearable. Perhaps the most unsettling category of uncanny photographs are those taken of wounded soldiers who posed to document their injuries. Doctors, eager to study battlefield medicine, photographed patients with amputated limbs or disfiguring wounds. The intention was clinical, but the results often appear macabre. A young man with one empty sleeve stares into the camera, his expression both defiant and hollow. Another photograph shows a soldier with a massive scar running across his torso, his shirt pulled aside to expose the wound. For modern viewers, these images blur the line between medical record and morbid curiosity. Yet they also reveal the courage of men willing to be seen in their most vulnerable states. Stranger still are the photographs of civilians who turned the war into spectacle. In some rare images, groups of people are shown picnicking on hillsides overlooking battles, their carriages parked in rows as if attending a public fair. Though shocking, these photographs remind us that the Civil War was, in part, a national event witnessed by ordinary people who sometimes treated it as grim entertainment. The presence of onlookers in photographs of battle preparations or aftermath adds a surreal dimension, war as both catastrophe and theater. Finally, there are the inexplicable images, the ones that defy easy categorization. A man in full uniform standing beside a carnival-style backdrop of painted clouds. A soldier posing with an enormous, almost comically oversized musket, perhaps a photographer's prop. Children dressed in miniature uniforms, their faces too young for the roles they were mimicking. These odd fragments resist neat interpretation. They are simply evidence that the Civil War, like all human experience, contained contradictions, moments of absurdity woven into an era defined by suffering. Taken together, the strange and uncanny photographs of the Civil War remind us that history is not only solemn and tragic. It is also messy, experimental, and often deeply human. The war was filled with odd inventions, jokes in the face of fear, attempts to find meaning in blurred exposures, and companionship found in animals and humor. These photographs complicate the story we tell, expanding it beyond generals and battles to include laughter, absurdity, and the surreal. And as we move beyond the uncanny, the lens turns toward the final act of this hidden history, the war's aftermath in memory, in monuments, and in the faces of survivors. Rare photographs of reunions, commemorations, and veterans remind us that the Civil War did not end with Appomattox, it lived on in the lives and images of those who endured. The guns fell silent in 1865, but the story of the Civil War did not end on the battlefield. For decades afterward, the war lived on, in memory, in monuments, and in the faces of those who survived. Rare photographs taken in the years after Appomattox preserve this lingering presence, offering us glimpses of aging veterans, solemn commemorations, and the evolving ways Americans chose to remember their most devastating conflict. These images, often overlooked, remind us that the Civil War was not just an event, it was a wound that bled into generations. Some of the most striking post-war photographs are portraits of veterans. In the decades following the conflict, thousands of men sat once more for the camera, their uniforms replaced by civilian clothes, their youthful faces now lined with age. Many posed proudly with their medals or Grand Army of the Republic badges, symbols of their service. In one rare image, a Union veteran with an empty sleeve sits upright, his gaze steady, the absence of his arm speaking more loudly than any medal. Another shows a Confederate veteran, his beard long and white, holding a tattered battle flag. These portraits carry a strange duality, they are at once triumphant and tragic, embodying both survival and loss. Reunions of veterans were also carefully documented. Photographs from Gettysburg in the 1880s and 1910s show gray-haired men in blue and gray uniforms clasping hands across stone walls where they once fought. In one haunting image, Union and Confederate veterans sit side by side on the very rocks of Devil's Den, where thousands had died decades earlier. Their smiles suggest reconciliation, but their eyes seem to carry memories that never faded. Such photographs became symbols of national healing, yet they also glossed over the unresolved divisions that continued to shape American society. Rare images of battlefield monuments tell another part of the story. In the years after the war, communities across North and South raised statues, obelisks, and memorial stones to honor their dead. Photographs of early dedication ceremonies reveal crowds gathered with banners, bands playing, widows in black standing near wreaths. At Gettysburg, cameras captured the unveiling of the Soldiers' National Monument, with Union veterans lined up in solemn rows. In the South, photographs of Confederate memorials show a similar ritual, though with very different political undertones. These images remind us that memory was contested, and that monuments were as much about shaping the future as honoring the past. Equally poignant are photographs of widows and orphans attending memorial events. One rare image shows a group of women in mourning dress gathered at Arlington National Cemetery, their faces hidden by veils as they place flowers on graves. Another shows children, too young to have remembered the war, standing beside their fathers' headstones, embodying the generational reach of loss. These photographs reveal that remembrance was not only the duty of veterans but also the burden of families who carried grief long after the battles ended. Photography also played a role in preserving the memory of the emancipation. Rare post-war portraits of formerly enslaved people, now dressed in their finest clothing, speak powerfully of transformation. Families who had once been denied the right to even exist legally now posed proudly together, their freedom recorded for posterity. Some images show black veterans of the Union Army, their uniforms still carefully preserved, their faces resolute. These photographs remind us that for many, the Civil War's legacy was liberation, a triumph too often overshadowed by narratives of reconciliation between North and South. The strangeness of time is evident in photographs that juxtapose the old and the new. Images exist of veterans posing beside cannons that had rusted into relics, or children climbing on battlefield monuments while elderly survivors watched. These photographs create a dialogue between past and present, showing how the war shifted from lived experience to history, from immediate trauma to collective memory. They are visual proof that remembrance itself evolves, that what one generation recalls as grief, the next may view as heritage. Some of the most haunting photographs are those of the last surviving veterans, taken near the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Their bodies frail, their uniforms threadbare, they sit in wheelchairs or lean on canes, still carrying the weight of memories from their youth. One photograph of Albert Wolson, the last verified Union veteran, who died in 1956, shows him as a very old man, his presence a living bridge to a conflict nearly a century past. Such images remind us that history is not distant, it is carried in the bodies of people who once walked among us. The act of remembering was not always solemn. Rare photographs from post-war parades and GR gatherings show veterans marching proudly, bands playing, flags waving, crowds cheering. For these men, remembrance was also celebration, a chance to reclaim camaraderie and pride. Yet even amid the festivities, the camera often captured moments of quiet reflection, an old soldier sitting apart from the crowd, staring into the distance, lost in memory. These small details reveal that for many, the war was never truly over. Taken together, the photographs of veterans, widows, orphans, and memorials show that the Civil War was not a closed chapter in 1865. It was a living presence, carried forward in memory, reshaped by ritual, and passed down through images. The war's hidden side is not only found in the chaos of battle or the strangeness of camp life, but in the long echo of remembrance that stretched across generations. And as the lens fades from these echoes of memory, we approach the final act of our story, the conclusion, where rare photographs and hidden histories converge into a lasting truth about the Civil War. What the camera preserved was not simply the war itself, but the soul of a nation struggling to define itself in the shadow of its greatest trial. As we close this journey through the rare photographs of the American Civil War, we find ourselves surrounded by echoes, faces and places that speak across a century and a half. The images we've explored are not simply relics, they are fragments of a lived reality, preserved by fragile glass plates and paper prints. They show us a war both familiar and foreign, a conflict told not through statistics and dates but through human presence. And in their stillness, they challenge us to see the Civil War not as a distant chapter, but as a human story still shaping the present. The power of these photographs lies in what they reveal and what they conceal. They reveal soldiers at rest, civilians in ruins, enslaved people claiming freedom, and veterans carrying scars long after the guns went silent. They reveal the women who stitched wounds, spied in shadows, and disguised themselves to fight. They reveal children who grew old too soon, mascots who marched beside regiments, and even the strange curiosities of wartime invention. Each image cracks open a hidden door in history, showing us something raw, unpolished, and intimate. At the same time, the photographs conceal. They cannot tell us every story. They do not record the cries of the wounded, the smell of burned fields, or the whispers of families torn apart. They do not show every act of courage, every betrayal, every moment of silent endurance. What they give us is incomplete, but it is enough to pull us closer. Enough to force us to confront the Civil War not as myth, but as reality. One of the most striking truths that emerges from these images is how war collapses boundaries. Soldiers and civilians, men and women, enslaved and free, all were drawn into its orbit. The camera bore witness to this collapse, flattening hierarchy in its lens. A general's portrait, polished and proud, exists alongside the candid photograph of a barefoot child in a ruined town. A battlefield corpse lies as still as a great leader posing in uniform. In the eye of the camera, every life mattered, every death mattered, every moment became part of the larger story. The Civil War camera also gave us something profoundly modern, the ability to look at war unfiltered. Before the 1860s, most Americans encountered battle through paintings or written accounts, often romanticized. But the lens offered no such illusions. It showed us swollen bodies, amputated limbs, refugees trudging beside wagons, widows weeping at graves. It forced Americans, then and now, to grapple with the costs of war in a way that words alone could never achieve. These photographs were, in their time, shocking revelations. Today, they remain stark reminders that war is not an abstraction. It is lived, it is suffered, it is endured. And yet, for all their tragedy, the photographs also reveal resilience. We see it in the freed families who posed proudly in their finest clothes, claiming the dignity denied to them for generations. We see it in the women who plowed fields, the veterans who marched in parades, the children who grew up among ruins but still carried forward the nation's future. We see it in the reunions of old enemies, clasping hands where once they traded fire. These images remind us that history is not only about loss but about the endurance of the human spirit. The hidden side of the Civil War, uncovered through these rare photographs, is not merely a supplement to the grand narrative. It is the heart of it. It tells us that war is not only about generals and battles but about ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. It tells us that freedom was not granted from above but claimed by those who had lived in bondage. It tells us that remembrance is not static, but contested, evolving, and deeply personal. As we look at these photographs today, we are asked to do more than observe. We are asked to remember. To remember the lives behind the images, the stories that may never have been written but are etched into every shadow and every face. To remember that the Civil War was not simply America's past, it remains woven into the fabric of its present. The divisions, the struggles for equality, the questions of identity and belonging, all of these are threads that continue. The camera, heavy and unwieldy as it was in the 1860s, captured more than it knew. It froze not just the people of that era, but the essence of a nation in conflict with itself. Each rare photograph is a doorway into that hidden war. And as we pass through those doorways, we carry with us the responsibility to see, to reflect, and to remember. For in the end, history is not only what was lived, it is what is remembered. And thanks to these photographs, the hidden side of the Civil War will never be entirely forgotten.